It's great to take a break from hitting the books and come and join you as part of the Logos team. This is the first of 4 Logos messages for 2012. And the focus today is the question, is the church relevant? Now, what is Logos? Logos is a group of about 12 people connected at KBC whose passion is really to commend and defend the Christian faith, particularly from an intellectual angle. And the foundation of this is really in 1 Peter 3:15, which says, always be prepared to give a defense to anyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that's within, but do it with gentleness and respect. And this is a task of apologetics. It means being able to dialogue with people from a whole range of beliefs and to help them make sense of why we follow Jesus. So that's what it's about. You see, as Christians, we're called to be able to share this great news with every single person. And I can guarantee that if you're about sharing this with others, objections will come up. Let's take this one. If Christianity is true, then why is the church such a mess? It's full of hypocrites, abusers, fanatics, and I know plenty more moral people outside the church who don't follow Jesus. It's a good question. So how would you respond to something like that? Now you might be thinking, why are these guys telling me that? I mean, I'm here on a rainy day with roadworks up the top. Of course I think the church is relevant. I'm here, right? And I think that's fantastic. But you know what? Logos can't reach all the workers, all the mums, the students, the retirees, a whole bunch of people who are never going to come into this building here. But you can. And our hope is that through these talks, through the discussion material, the discussion guide you can download, the note outline, our hope is that you might use these resources to know how to winsomely commend Christ and His kingdom to your colleagues, your family, your friends. That is what Logos is about. Now, maybe you don't normally come here. Maybe a friend invited you. You got questions about the whole God thing. Following Jesus isn't really where you're at. I think that's fantastic that you come here. And I just want to say that our hope is that this talk might help you on that journey, that it might make a bit more sense of what Christianity is about. And this is an open invite to everyone, but particularly if that's where you're coming from, that you've got questions. After the 5 p.m. service tonight at 7 o'clock, there'll be a group of us up here, pretty informally up the front, and you can ask any question, say anything you want. It just is a chance to continue that dialogue, maybe on this topic or on anything to do with belief. You might want to, for instance, debrief the latest Q&A session between George Pell and Richard Dawkins. Whatever you want to talk about, it's an open space to continue asking those kind of big questions. Now, when Logos presents, we don't pull our punches. Our purpose is to be like a mirror, and that means we reflect the good and the bad. And that's why we use things like dramas. I swear it's not to cause offense, though I guarantee some of you will probably feel a little bit offended, because the purpose is to use humor to bring out a perspective of how those outside the church see us. You understand? So it's not necessarily us saying this is what we think the church is like, but we need to get a type of mirror, even if it's done through caricature, to see how others perceive us, which got us in the Logos team thinking on a creative level. Have you ever seen those infomercials, you know, where they sell all kinds of stuff like steak knives? It got us thinking, if the church were a product, who would purchase? Cue the Chapmans and let's take a look.
Hi! Are you sick of feeling sinful, generally unrighteous, lacking in holiness? Would you like that feeling of moral superiority while still pursuing your comfortably secular consumerist lifestyle? Don't you wish it was easier to get that self-righteous glow you've always wanted? Well, now you can, for the low, low price of 1 hour per week sitting and looking like you're awake. And where? In church! At church, you get a guilt-free life for eternity. You get the added social benefits of only associating with the right sort of people and the lifelong satisfaction of knowing that you're always right. Because at church, we've been doing it for people for nearly 2,000 years. Let's have a look and see what happens when someone goes to church. See how forlorn and lost, rejected and lonely, ugly and spotty she looks before she goes to church. Let's look at the transformation when she comes to church. Wow, what a difference! Ms. Sunday Churchgoer, tell us, would you like to tell us what effect going to church has had on your life?
Why, yes! Now I go to church for 1 hour once a week. I know truly superior and better to everyone else in every way. And I also know that I don't have to listen to anybody else's opinion but my own,
Wow.
because I am always correct.
Fantastic.
And on top of that, I don't have to hang around with anybody who isn't middle class and clean.
She's got it.
It's such a blessing!
And speaking of blessings, at church we have the blessing of the self-righteous points reward system. Every time you go to church, you rack up 10 self-righteous points on your reward system. 100 points, and you're going to the basic Bible Bash level. 150 points, and you get into the golden goody goodies level. 200 points, and you're into the superior saintly souls level. And if you make a $10,000 donation to the Let's Buy the Pastor a Ferrari fund, then you'll get a place in heaven for all eternity. It's that simple. Just 1 hour a week. Keep up the front, and you haven't got to change a thing about your lifestyle. It's that simple. And speaking of simple, let's get onto your telephones now. Dial a number that appears on the screen, and you can double your self-righteous points if you answer this simple question. Who was voted the best-dressed churchgoer in Brisbane in 2012? Double your points right now. Why? Look, here's Candy. Hi, Candy.
Hi, Brad!
Have you got something that'll keep us entertained until we go to church next week?
I sure do, Brad!
Wow, would you like to tell us about it, Candy?
I sure would, Brad! When I feel stale, I just splash on some church body scent.
Wow.
This will cover up the unseemly odors given off by sinful pheromones and surround you with a truly impressive aura of goodness.
Fantastic.
And it's only $99.95 or 20% off when you reach the Super Saintly Souls level.
What a bargain! Isn't she fantastic? This product is not scientifically researched or tested because we believe in blind faith. Well, that looks like it. Wrapping it up for Church in the City this week. Our final guest on the evening, ladies and gentlemen, is happy to recommend and endorse this final fantastic product that you've just seen. Let us now hear the endorsement for Church from our final guest.
Hi, I'm Paris Milton,
Wow. She's here.
and I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to the Oscars tonight. And I'm here to recommend Synagogue.
Church. Church.
Oh, sorry, church. And I just like to say that it's just really, really out there and up and really, and all the starving children and world peace and my dog matches my handbag. Thank you.
Thank you, Paris. She's fantastic. So there it is, folks. Just 1 hour a week. 1 hour a week, and you haven't got to change anything about your lifestyle. Remember, church, 2,000 years of keeping it exclusive, judgmental, and fake.
Thank you, guys. They're always in the habit of leaving this up the front. It's meant to be sackcloth and ashes or something for me. I don't know what that is. But, and yes, that number does work in case you're wondering whether you want to order something or you want to make a complaint, hopefully the former. So onto today's topic. We're going to be looking at, is the church relevant? Now, over the years, I've presented on all kinds of apologetics topics, stuff like the resurrection, God's existence, the afterlife, all the big questions. And so I was really interested when McCrindle Research recently presented the Australian Communities Report. Now, I knew that this report would have some jarring findings. It was focused on what are the major belief blockers to Australians taking Christianity seriously. And I knew it would be jarring in some ways because over the last 30 years, are you aware that church affiliation has dropped by 30%? That's 1% per year. Such that by the next census, probably only half of Australians will have any type of connection, even nominal, with the church. That's a big shift. So it seems that there's growth in a number of segments. One is atheists, but actually the major segment you could call is the apatheists. They're people who, for them, church is irrelevant. and they're really apathetic about any type of institutional religion. So back onto the report. If you were to guess what the top 10 belief blockers for Australians are, what would you say? Well, let's go through the list from 10 to 1. Number 10, the exclusivity of the church, like a religious clique. Number 9 is our attitudes to homosexuality. 8, hell and condemnation. 7, that the church is outdated and irrelevant. 6, issues around how Christians deal with money and the church approaches that. 5, the big question of suffering. 4, religious views. 3, judging others. 2, our hypocrisy. And number 1, drum roll, church abuse. That's an interesting list. Now, notice anything strange there. There's hell and suffering there, but out of the 10 major belief blockers, 7 of them have got nothing to do with our message. They're about us, Christians. Really interesting. So what do we do with that? Now, theologian Leslie Newbigin said that the best apologetic for the gospel is a community of people who believe it and who live by it. You see, the church is the best and the worst argument for Christianity. And a lot of people in our culture, as opposed to the last series we just did in KBC, instead of rating the church as irresistible, I'd probably say it's repulsive. So how are we to respond to this? And there's a dozen reports that tell the same story. It would seem that the church has an incy-wincy image problem. Fair to say? I think so. Now, evangelist Mike Frost tells of a conversation he had with a non-Christian friend of his who's a businessman. And this guy didn't know too much about Mike, but when he found out that Mike was a Christian author, he said, I'm going to give you a bit of a business advice. And he said, Mike, here's the problem. You've got a great product, but your delivery system is stuffed. And he said, what do you mean? He said, well, your product's Jesus, right? And he's still got some, relevance and appeal, but your delivery system, the church, just does not get the product to the market. Now, it's kind of a crass way of putting it, but I think it's perhaps correct. Good product, really bad PR. Now, this is not about the church leading by opinion polls, but it is a mirror. It's about asking ourselves, is this what we're like? And it raises the deeper question, what is the church anyway? What are we here for? Now, let me start by telling you what the church is not. Now, despite our really loose language, church is not something you go to. Are you going to church on Sunday? That actually doesn't make any sense scripturally. Church is not something you go to. It's not a hobby. It's not a religious group. It's not a Sunday service. And it's not even a building. The Greek word in the New Testament for church is ekklesia. And as Frank Viola said, to the ears of a first century believer, if they heard you calling the church, the ekklesia, a building, that would be like calling your wife a condominium or your mother-in-law a skyscraper. Why? Because in every one of the 114 references in the New Testament to the ekklesia, every one of them is about the church being an assembly of people who belong to the Lord. It's a bunch of people. So it doesn't matter whether you're Africans meeting under a tree or if you're Chinese meeting in a village shack or even Westerners in a cathedral. The church is not a building and there is no rigid structure. It really is a bunch of people who follow Jesus. A group of people who join together to grow like Jesus, to worship God, to share this life with others, to care for one another. It really is a diverse community of opposites who unite together as one. In short, the church is an apprenticeship in how to love. That's what it's supposed to be. Now, the New Testament uses a lot of different images for the church. Let's take just one. The church is the body of Christ. What does that mean? It means that Christ, Jesus, is the head, and he directs his body, the church, to do what he did in the world, which means that the church should look like him. So our purpose then is like Jesus' purpose. It's to alert people through our words and through our deeds to know that God is real, that he has saved this world, and he is saving this world through Christ. And above all, it means that it's through our love for our neighbour that they will know that God is real. Now, we've told this story many times, but the big story is that we were designed for good, but through our sin we've been damaged by evil. So God steps in through Jesus and restores us for better. So what does that mean for the church now? Well, it means that the church now is called by God, sent in his power, that we're sent together to help heal a hurting world. That we're meant to be ambassadors for this kind of life. That we're meant to be a light showing the nations what life is all about. Now, if the church truly did this, would we be relevant? I would say yes, we would be relevant. There is no more relevant message. But we need to turn back to that mirror to see, is this who we actually are? Now, we've got to note that the church has never been perfect. We're human, right? I think we've got a picture just coming up here of kind of how often Christianity is perceived. You know, the first disciples really thought that Jesus was their ticket to bringing down the Roman Empire and setting themselves up as the new power elite who would call the shots. If Jesus hadn't corrected them, that's exactly where it would have gone right at the start. Instead, it took perhaps 300 to 400 years to go some of that direction. You see, what they wanted was a Jewish Caesar. They wanted a new president. But when Christ comes in as the crucified Savior, everything changes. When Jesus steps in, authority becomes humility. Hypocrisy becomes authenticity. And we find that exclusivity opens up to embrace the whole world. Such a different frame of reference. So let's switch gears. What we're going to do is explore these three major categories of belief blockers through the frame of Jesus' life. I'm going to tag team with Brendan White. I'm going to look at the authority issue. And then Brendan's going to look at the exclusivity and the hypocrisy of the church as perceived today. So let's start with issue number one, authority. The church. The church is about controlling people. At least that's how it's often perceived. You know the picture. You've got the dominant senior pastor who directs everyone else and tells them exactly what you must do and controls them from on high. And a lot of people, they can't stand this idea. They don't want to be controlled, so instead they flee the church, you know, like the plague, and they think they're safer outside. But even there, the church interferes. One blogger was commenting on the decline of church in Australia, and his comment, his solution was that the church, quote, stopped sticking their noses into everyone else's business. Politics, child raising, court systems, sexual preferences, etc., etc. Now, with all of our lobbying for political control, we're often known more for what we stand against than what we stand for. Thanks, I was peeking out a little bit there. You see, the church is often known more for our grab for authority, our casting of judgment, which can really hide God's call to life and his gift of grace. At least, this is how it is perceived. There may be a big gap between perceptions and reality, but we need to be aware of how we are perceived and then question, is this who we really are? So that's the question then. Is this how it should be? Now, as I said before, the church isn't an organisation. Theologically defined, the church is an organism. You ever seen the Transformers movie? It's a bit like where you've got all these different parts that kind of, when the parts come together, it should look like Jesus. That's really what the church is supposed to be. So how did Jesus wear his authority? And was he about control? Well, first things first, there is a massive difference between legitimate and illegitimate authority. Let's say I went into your workplace or into your school and I started bossing everyone around. There'd be a slight problem there, wouldn't there? Why? Because I'm not the boss. But let's say I was. So let's try a thought experiment. If Jesus is who he claimed to be God, doesn't that change everything? Now you might want to question whether he is actually who he claimed to be. But if he is God, then doesn't he have legitimate authority? And can't he extend that authority to who he wishes? Now, if that's the case, the question is not, does he have authority? The question is, how did he wear this authority? And this is the bottom line. Jesus was no authoritarian dictator. He wielded absolute authority with ultimate humility. Now, have you ever seen that TV show, Undercover Boss? I really like that show. I first saw it when I was living over in Canada. They got like episodes all around the world. And the idea is really simple, right? You've got this boss of this massive company who decides to don the worker's uniform and enter in as just part of the team. Scrubbing dishes, delivering the mail, answering the phones. And when it gets to the end of the week, it's a bit like Judgment Day for the whole team. He's worked as an equal, but then all of a sudden they see the true colors, and the boss, he or she, reveals who they are, and everyone's held accountable for how they've lived. Now, I think this is almost like a pointer to the ultimate story, that Jesus is the ultimate undercover boss. Let's take just 2 incidents. Number 1, Easter. We've just celebrated it, right? You know that during this time, everyone has abandoned Jesus. Peter backstabbed him 3 times, and the bunch of first disciples are just feeling dirty and rotten about this. They're guilty as hell, and they have fled with the Messiah crucified. They've fled back to their old life. So you can picture them out there, Peter and the whole crew, and they're out there fishing again, just looking after their own needs, serving themselves. And then they look in the distance and they see the smoke rising up, and they're straining their eyes and they get the waft of, what is that? Is that like fish? Is someone cooking us fish on the beach? Someone making breakfast for us? Who is that? And they look closer. It's the boss. It's Jesus. He's actually defeated death. He is the Lord of all. Now, if I was Peter at that point, I'd be thinking, I am in deep, deep trouble. Now, granted, there is stuff to sort out. There's a relationship to man, things to talk through. But notice what doesn't happen. There's no lecture. There's no punishment. Just love and forgiveness. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. Now, let's take incident number 2. John chapter 8. Perhaps you know this story. A woman is caught in the very act of having sex with someone else's husband. Kind of awkward. Now, under the law of the day, she should be killed. She should be stoned to death. So the religious leaders bring her out knowing this and throw her down there in the dirt in front of Jesus. Your call, Jesus. They're trying to catch him out, right? Your turn to judge. Showed your true colors. But what does he do? He turns the tables. He says, okay, whoever of you guys is without sin, you throw the first stone and everyone else can kind of follow you on. And then drop, drop, drop. One by one, these guys drop their rocks. They've all got sin. And they walk away. Now notice what Jesus said. He says, woman, where are your accusers? Now go and sin no more. Go and sin no more. Jesus is not there to judge her. But notice what he didn't say. He didn't say it to her, and he definitely didn't say it also to the person who's probably more responsible, being the guy. Where is the guy? He doesn't say, woman, man, why don't you just go on having an affair and wrecking people's lives and leaving a trail of devastation? Just go and do whatever you feel like. He doesn't say that. Are you getting the point here? You see, Jesus in this is not there to judge. He's not there to condemn. But nor is he there to just say, do what you want. It's not going to matter. He doesn't want to work like that. He does call out the sin. A very big difference. And the church is meant to look like Jesus. Our job is not to grasp for control or to judge, but nor is it to sit silently by while people do stuff that hurts themselves or hurts others. Now, if you're a parent and you had a 4-year-old, your 4-year-old go to stick a fork into a live power socket, would you say something? I mean, to not is negligent. Worse, it's unloving. So Jesus did call out sin, but it was always out of love. And he extended to his body, the church, this same authority, not to condemn, but to call people to life, to choose, instead of what leads to death, to choose what leads to life and to freedom. Now, Jesus was not a control freak. Read through the Gospels. If I was there, I would have been a lot more in control than that, because it's like, what are you doing, man? It's getting out of control. Like, sort it out. He just lets things go quite often. And, you know, his disciples are having this big fight over who's going to be first, the power one among them, the big dog. And instead, Jesus, he takes the servants, the slave's towel, and wraps it over himself, and he washes their feet. It's like he's saying, guys, if you want to be first, you're going to have to be last. Play the bottom job. Are you greater than your master? You know, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve and to give my life as a ransom for many. Jesus wore his authority with humility. He leveraged his power on behalf of the least. And as his body, the church, we should too. Jesus was not about being the star of the show. He's the undercover boss. And he gives equal authority to every Christian, not to one mega leader at the center to manipulate the rest. This is a flat structure. We are all parts of Christ's body, and the head communicates directly with us through his Spirit. And it's only when we're all united together as one, serving, that this authority is actually seen in the world in the way it should be. The authority is not to control. Instead, our authority is to serve each other and give up our life as a ransom for many. Now, is this actually happening? I just finished reading probably the premier sociologist in this field, Robert Putnam, has written a 700-page book called American Grace, and he states comparative studies all around the world. And his conclusion is, are Christians walking the talk? Yes. The best sociological data would say that when you compare someone who is a committed Christian, connected with a church, that they are 2 to 3 times more likely to give to charity, including 2 to 3 times the amount, that they are more generous, that they volunteer more hours than a person who has got no affiliation with the church or is secular. This is the best sociological data point in this direction. And that's even on top of their religious duty. So in his comment, Christians on average are walking the talk. So I've got to question whether there's a gap between sometimes perception and reality. At the moment, the church collectively gives at least as much as the government towards welfare, serving the least of these. Now, what does this look like at a grassroots level, say, for instance, in our congregation here? Well, I'll tell you what it looks like. It looks like a senior pastor, you might as well call him a janitor, who can't help but clean up your trash and scrub the toilets after you leave this place. It looks like countless volunteers every Sunday who serve the kids and those with disabilities as equally reflecting the glory of God, especially in their weakness. It's not about this authority role, it's about liberating all people. It looks like people like Coral Bryant, one of hundreds that I know, and Coral's out at the dog park in Balbarry. She's got a list of over 400 people in her book. She prays for them all, she knows them all, and she's all the time dropping off hampers and visiting people in hospital. Looks like that. It looks like growth groups week in, week out, where instead of having one big dog ruling the thing, what it actually looks like is each leader is a servant leader, each person serving and contributing. It looks like the groups going out, even a year after Brisbane's floods, to help rebuild houses or businesses, as we got the opportunity to do in the Logos team. And even more than political lobbying, as legitimate as that is, it looks like individual Christians in their everyday vocation seeking first the kingdom of God. Through the way they stock shelves, they serve kids, the way they teach, the way they work in the hospitals, as they work to cultivate this world. That's what it's about, this kind of humble service, not for what we can get, but for what we can give. Now, harsh judgmentalism is probably best identified with the culture wars in America. So before I pass on to Brendan, I want to have a look at a clip with you so you get a picture of what the church's authority looks like when expressed in one of the edgiest cities in America, being San Francisco. Every week, hundreds of volunteers from many, many denominations join together under the Golden Gate Bridge to serve the least of these.
So we're seen as an insular and inward-looking club, a bit obsessed with ourselves, and sort of judging, excluding of those who don't belong. And many people I've actually spoken with have said they've felt excluded either because of their sexuality or how they read the Bible, or honestly, even if they don't raise their hands during the worship. Now look, it's important to realise that it's wrong, obviously, to exclude people in those sorts of ways. But there's a big difference between actually excluding people and having truths in your faith that are exclusive. You see, all truth claims are exclusive. So the atheist who believes that God doesn't exist, if he's right, which he's not, but if he's right, it excludes my belief that God is real. You see, only one of them can be right, and the one that's right excludes the other one. That's just how truth works. But that said, the church as a place should never be excluding people. We are a refuge where everyone and anyone is welcome. And the reason we want that to be so is because we're following the model of Jesus. And Jesus, he just couldn't have lived a more inclusive lifestyle. I mean, he just broke social taboos. He just ignored the restrictions of his society and religion. He spent time with the diseased, with lepers, with outcasts. He spent time with ethnically excluded or marginalised groups like the Samaritans. He spent time with what was considered to be the worst sinners, so prostitutes and tax collectors. And so Jesus has given us this wonderful model of an inclusive, loving community. I'll give you an analogy. Imagine if you were at a wedding reception. You've all probably been, hopefully. There's people who've been to wedding receptions. Lovely event. The bride and groom stands up and says to the guests, look, we've invited you, but now we want you to go out and invite anyone you know to come back to this wedding reception to be part of it. And that's kind of what the church is like. We're to go out and we're to draw people into our loving community. And I actually heard a story about someone in America who did something like this. They actually, at their wedding reception, they got a big bus they'd rented, they went through their city, and they picked up all the homeless people in that city that they'd been working with, and they brought them back to their wedding reception, and then they, the bride and groom, served them. And that's just a wonderful example of how the church can be an inclusive community and how they can get it right. I mean, within this local church, we have a ministry that's inclusive just like that. It's called, has anyone heard of the Helping Hands ministry? Wonderful thing. On every Tuesday night, they get together. They've got an old combi van. They fill it full of warm coffee, tea, some food, and they go to some of the homeless shelters in Ipswich, and anywhere between 30 and 70 people know that on that Tuesday night, they can find not only a warm drink, but also someone who'll talk to them, who'll listen to them, and who'll pray with them. Another ministry I've been involved with occasionally is called Waiters Union. The idea is waiting on people like a waiter. And it's built on the concept of just being friends with people who have no friends. So one of the things they do at St Andrews in the city every second Friday, a handful of Christians, perhaps 5 people, will come along with a home-cooked meal, so potluck, just bring a dish, and then 20 or 12 or so people will come in who aren't Christians usually, and they'll share that meal with you. And the people who come, though, to that church at that night, usually they have backgrounds living on the street, or they have very obvious mental health problems or severe emotional trauma that they've suffered in their lives. And the idea is just to include them in a meal, to reach out to them and be a community for them. The Chapmans who did the drama at the start shared with me about Oxley Uniting Church that has a wonderfully inclusive reputation. One of the things they do at their church is every second Wednesday, they go and collect people who are involved in their community, who have sort of physical or mental disabilities, people in wheelchairs, Down syndrome, autism, that sort of thing, cerebral palsy, and they bring them to their church on the Wednesday night just for a night of fun and games. And that's it. It's just to bring some light into their lives, just to lighten things up. And that, Sue said, when she was having her kids grow up in that church, showed them a community that had sought to make themselves accessible. And those are just 3 examples of where the church can be out there, including people in the community they have. And so look, when the church is exclusive, for whatever reason, that makes us irrelevant. That's true. But the flip side of the coin is that when the church, at its best, is a loving and inclusive community, it draws people in, just like Jesus did. And it's definitely not wrong, just in case you don't know, to have a close, loving community within your local church congregation like KBC. Because that's exactly what people love. They come for that. The trick is to let them come in, to make them welcome and make them a part of it, and even to go and find people who might not otherwise make it. Is the clip is ready? All right, this clip was about Dave Benson's section, but it still fits.
About 70 volunteers from about 10 to 14 different churches. Our focus is really to love people the way we think Jesus would love on people. These are the kind of places that we think Jesus would show up if he were here today. That's what Bridgetown does. It provides an opportunity, obviously, for the body of Christ to come be the church rather than just go to church on a Sunday. And then they find out they're not afraid of these people, and these people are people that they normally lock their doors on. Now they're engaging in conversation with.
In addition to providing food, clothing, and toiletries, these volunteers offer something more valuable: respect and tenderness. It's one thing to stand in church mumbling the words to an old hymn, and it's another entirely to get down on your knees and wash the feet of a homeless person.
I learned last week and I did a couple, and it's just, people just love it. I myself was homeless for the last 4 years, and more than food and everything, people crave hugs and touch. And the hardest part for me washing feet is that we have to use gloves, and especially people already when we're on the street, you feel like you're dirty and nobody wants to touch you.
It really feels good to have your feet washed, massaged, clean
Our old friend Tom Kratmaker took a break from writing his new book, Onward Christian Athlete, to visit Night Strike.
One thing that was most inspiring to me was that they were not judging the moral worthiness of the homeless people they were helping. Going into it, they knew some of them were going to be drunk, some were high. Were they lazy? Is that why they were homeless? From that perspective of radical compassion, those questions are completely irrelevant.
We encourage the people here to not just come and serve them, but to get a bowl of food and actually sit down and eat with them, actually get to know their name. We want people to know Jesus, obviously, but we're really more, to be honest with you, really more interested that we get to know someone's name first, and then let the conversation go where the conversation will go.
Why do you think these people choose to come down to help out? If you were to guess, I think it's because they're Christian and they got Christ in them. You know? That's what moves them to do what they do.
They help because they are Christians and have Christ in them. And he's obviously not a Christian. He's one of the men who is homeless. This is sort of the thing that makes the church relevant. If the antidote to being authoritarian is humble service, that's how Jesus wielded his authority. Now, the final issue to talk about tonight is that of hypocrisy. I know I've spoken with a lot of Christians who've actually left the church, not this particular church, but other churches, and people who are pushed away, so I don't want to go near a church. What they tell me is they often perceive the church to have a really morally superior attitude, and they see that Christians profess what they don't possess, and they talk about just blatant hypocrisy on the part of Christians in the church. And it's something that comes up in the surveys, that hypocrisy is often what pushes people away. Look, the first thing we can say is that hypocrisy is certainly something that is wrong and something we'd strive to change in our own lives. Jesus, when he was alive, he condemned hypocrisy, and that means it's something we would want to change. But that said, what can you do about it? Really, all you can do when you've made a mistake is just to say sorry as an individual, and even potentially on behalf of the church if need be. I know I'm not a Catholic, but I'm actually a big fan of the last Pope, John Paul II. He had an amazing life, and one of the things that he did that really inspired me was he apologised for all the mistakes and hypocrisy of the Catholic Church. In March of 2000, he did this Jubilee apology, and he said sorry for the Catholic Church's involvement in the Aboriginal stolen generation, the priest sex scandals, the Crusades, all of it. But putting aside apologising, we have to realise the church will never be free of the problem of hypocrisy. Even when Jesus lived a perfect life and he had a morally exemplary example and he was all about helping people, even he was criticised by his contemporaries for being hypocritical. They said, "Oh, you're spending all the time with the sinners, the prostitutes, the tax collectors." And his response was, "It's not the healthy that need a doctor, but the sick." And the point he's making is this: the church is supposed to be an inclusive community where people who have a drug addict or drug addiction are welcome, or people who might be trying to save their marriage from the effects of gambling. Anyone and everyone is welcome. And because we let imperfect people in, that's everybody, we're going to have people who make mistakes, and that's just part of it. You see, one of the things that I love about our faith is that it is almost unique. What makes it so special amongst other worldviews is that it's centered on grace, on the loving kindness of Jesus and his grace to all. The fact that if you've done something wrong and you've been hypocritical, you know you can not only be forgiven but fully pardoned. So we're never going to get rid of that problem of hypocrisy because we have to let imperfect people in. That's everybody. But as I've said, what makes us so special is that we are this religion of grace, that we have the graceful example of Jesus. And as we'll look at two examples of what it looks like when the church gets grace right, when we go out and give to others what they couldn't give themselves. So within our own church, we have the Tour of Hope ministry in June, and what they are doing is charity bike ride. The money that's raised goes into a community development projects around the world in underprivileged areas. So there's a Kenyan home. There's a Kenyan home in children's home, and they just have built a water bore. They've done clean showers and toilets they've built for them, and they've done free dentistry work. And that's just within our church community. And another ministry that I came across when researching this topic was called Bethel. And they work all over the world with people who have serious substance dependence, which basically just means they're hardcore drug addicts. And they take them off, usually the streets, and they put them in a small community, in a small house with some Christians, and they help them to dry out, overcome their drug addiction, and repair and rebuild their lives. In fact, one of the members of Logos has actually been to one of these houses in Italy, and they've seen the transformative work that was being done as these people had their lives restarted and regrown. So I have a quick clip just to show you what the great work that Bethel's doing.
How can you expect people in the right minds to not see between the cracks? Notice that there's something missing, wouldn't you agree? Now is the right time to be all that we can be. Yeah, come on! Come and dream with me. We were all together in perfect unity. We are torn apart, things that do not matter. Time is running out for us to see. We gotta turn this life around, turn this life around, turn this life. We gotta turn this life around, turn this.
All of us at the same, whether we're a drug addict or whatever we are, we have this big need for love, you know. And when you come to Bethel, it is the first thing you notice. And most of the addicts, when they give a testimony, say, what struck me was the love. You know, people loved me. People that normally on the street would stick a knife to my neck and take my drugs or take my money, loved me. And they served me, you know. And they, I don't know, they gave me things and they didn't expect anything in return. And that spoke volumes to me. And through that, I learned, you know, they've changed. I want to be like that. Now, how did they change? And then they begin to question, and God begins to reveal himself to them.
So Bethel works in 80 cities in 21 nations around the world. That's an immense amount of good they're doing. And if you asked one of those drug addicts, is the church relevant? All they could tell you is, all I know of the church is that it took me off the street and it's helped transform my life. So of course it's relevant. Now look, perhaps the final part of the answer to the problem of hypocrisy is to look at Jesus and realize how authentic and genuine he was. You see, part of the issue of hypocrisy is a person sort of denying what everyone else can see is true about them. And then you look at Jesus and how authentic and genuine he was, and you realize what can attract people to you and your faith is actually when you just admit that you're not perfect, that you have doubts or fears and that you've made mistakes, and it's during those hard times that you've relied on your Christian community and your faith. Now look, to finish this off, we've looked at 3 specific criticisms of the church, but the overarching theme running through them is that the church in today's world is irrelevant. And while there's some truth that we have to acknowledge to those 3 specific criticisms, in the final analysis, is the church irrelevant? Well look, I promise you there's an army of compelling and diverse reasons I'd love to share with you. But I want to just distill it down to the 2 most powerful and complete reasons that you could share with someone if they asked you, is the church relevant? The first is that the church is relevant because it holds in its hands the most satisfying answers to life's most meaningful questions. For instance, many people will perhaps tell you, if you ever ask them, what do you think of death? They usually feel that death is wrong if they're of sound mind. Most people aren't very keen on the idea of dying. And the church's response is death does feel wrong because it is. And in fact, there is an afterlife, and in one place or another you will continue to be. Now, another example of, perhaps the best example of the information the church holds in its hands is that there is a God who not just exists, but that he loves us with unimaginable passion, and he wants us to know that love now and in the life to come, and that our existence here on earth, whatever the process was not an accident. Now, if those things are true, they feel like pretty relevant pieces of information. And the church, for all its flaws, for the last 2,000 years has been passing that information, that call along from one generation to the next. And the second reason that the church is relevant is through the actions of followers of Jesus. Throughout history, what has always made the church relevant to a hurting world is the good Christians do when they follow Jesus. You can think of Mother Teresa, you can think of the clips, you can think of all the things that you've ever seen a church do when they go into a community to help a hurting world. So look, if you've come here today and you're someone who isn't a believer, that's fantastic. And hopefully in the last sort of 45 minutes, we've just been able to give you a taste of why the church might be relevant and perhaps start a dialogue with you as to what role the church could play in your life. But obviously, as Dave said, almost all of this audience would be Christian, and you obviously probably believe the church is relevant. Here you are sitting in a church building. But what Dave and I hope to achieve is just to be able to better equip you to answer friends, families or strangers if they ever ask you, hey, I don't think the church is relevant. And the answer you can tell them is it's relevant because it holds life's most satisfying answers. So there's an afterlife, heaven, hell, the purpose and meaning of suffering. You know the answers to that, you can share it with them. And you can tell them it's relevant by what Christians do. And you can think of any good example of Christians doing good. That shows that the church is relevant. You go to that Kenyan child's sort of school that Tour of Hope supports, and you ask those kids to think of the church, they're going to have good things to say. But look, the challenge to finish, and this is the most important part, is to realise that we, Christians, are to be the answer to the question, is the church relevant? If the church is going to have any relevance, it's through what we say and what we do. We are to be the answer in a hurting world to some of the problems that face the world. And look, just at the end of the notes, just as a sort of a prompt, I've left a bit of space there for the 3 issues that we've looked at. And perhaps in the next song or in your quiet time tomorrow, just consider, has God spoken to you about any of these 3 issues? Perhaps there's someone that you could include in this church community, invite them to directions, or perhaps there's someone you need to apologise to if you've done something hypocritical. Whatever it is that God speaks to you, remember, we are the answer to whether the church is relevant in today's world. Let's invite the band back up. I'll just close in prayer. And just remember too that if you want to come back with questions, we're here at 7 o'clock for a panel. And if you want to do a study on this topic, in the notes you'll find a website and you can download a study guide. Or I'll just close in prayer. Dear Lord God, just thank you for sending your Son, Jesus. Thank you for his wonderful example of grace, of authenticity, of humility and inclusivity. And Lord, just help us be able to better follow Jesus' model. Amen.